Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 14 deeply unsettling stories from rural backroads across the country, isolated stretches of road, forgotten trails, and hollow ground where people ventured out and came back changed. Some of them barely came back at all. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Let's get into it. Story 1. There's a stretch of road in the hill country of central Texas that doesn't appear on most maps anymore. I know because I checked afterward, obsessively, the kind of checking you do when you need someone else to confirm that a place exists. Route 9 Spur, locals called it. A 6-mile ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through cedar scrub and dry creek beds that hadn't held water in 20 years. My Uncle Terrence had driven it every day for 30 years to reach his leatherwork shop on the other side of the ridge. When he died and left me the shop, he left me the road too. I want to be honest about something. I was never close with Terrence. He was my father's brother, quieter than our side of the family, the kind of man who answered questions with nods or grunts and seemed to find most conversation an imposition. The shop was a surprise. My father hadn't even known Terrence had a will. So when I drove down from Austin in late October, I was equal parts grieving and calculating, trying to figure out what a leatherwork business in the middle of nowhere was actually worth. I remember the drive down well. The radio lost signal around mile marker 4. I noticed because I'd been listening to an afternoon talk show that cut out mid-sentence and never came back. The cedar smelled sharp and medicinal, almost antiseptic, and the October light had that particular low slant quality that makes shadows stretch twice as long as they should. I stopped once to check my phone, which had no service. I'd packed a cooler with 2 sodas and a wrapped sandwich from a gas station in Fredericksburg. The sandwich had mustard on it even though I'd asked for no condiments. I remember being mildly annoyed about that. Funny what you remember. The shop was fine. Locked up, dusty, but structurally sound. I spent most of the afternoon taking an inventory, tools, leather stock, some finished saddle work Terrence had never sold. I found a coffee maker in the back room and made a pot even though I didn't really want coffee. I think I just needed the noise. The shop had this quality of silence that felt loaded, not peaceful, like the quiet in a room after someone said something wrong. I was planning to drive back that same evening, but it got dark faster than I expected. I stayed later than I meant to, going through a filing cabinet. So it was close to 9 when I finally locked up and walked back to my truck, and the road back through the cedar was pure black except for my headlights. About 2 miles in, I saw the dog. At least I thought it was a dog. It was standing at the edge of the road, just inside where my headlights reached, and it was dark-colored, brown or black. I couldn't tell, and roughly dog-sized. But when I slowed down, I noticed it wasn't moving the way a dog moves. Most animals, when a car slows and the headlights pin them, they either freeze or bolt. This one turned, deliberately slowly, like it was choosing to look at me, and when it turned I saw that its face was wrong, not dog wrong. The proportions were off in a way I kept trying to assign to shadow or the distortion of headlights because the alternative didn't make sense. The snout was too flat, the eyes were set too wide, and it was watching me with a patience that felt considered. I drove around it, gave it a wide berth, heart going a little faster than I wanted to admit. Told myself it was a coyote or a feral dog that looked strange in the dark. Something had gotten into a fight once, maybe, had its face rearranged. Things happened to animals out here. The road dipped down through a dry creek crossing and then climbed back up, and it was at the top of that climb that I saw the first one standing, upright, on 2 legs, motionless at the side of the road, maybe 20 feet away. It was tall, taller than a person, but only slightly, and thin in a way that made me think of something dehydrated down to its essential parts. Its arms were too long. Not dramatically, not movie monster long, but wrong enough that when my headlights swept across it, my brain filed an immediate complaint before I could talk myself out of it. Its skin, and it was skin, pale and matte, was pulled across the joints of its shoulders and hips so tightly that I could see the shapes moving underneath as it turned to watch me pass. I did not stop. I want to be clear about that. I kept driving at exactly the speed I was going, which felt important somehow, like speeding up or slowing down would be an acknowledgement. I watched it in my rearview mirror until the road curved and it was gone. There were two more. One further up the road, standing in the cedar scrub just far enough that I might have convinced myself it was a tree if it hadn't shifted weight from one foot to the other as I passed. The last one was standing in the middle of the road. I had to stop for that one. I couldn't drive through it. We sat like that for what felt like a long time, probably 30 seconds, with my headlights on it and my foot resting above the brake. It was looking at my truck with that same patient attention, and I was looking at it, and I had this feeling, this absolute clarity that it was deciding something. That whatever came next depended on its decision and not mine. Then it walked off the road. Not quickly, not startled, just walked that too smooth gait into the cedar and was gone. I drove the rest of the way out at 80 miles an hour and didn't touch the brake once. When I got home, I found 3 small stones arranged on the hood of my truck. Flat, smooth creek stones that had no business being there. I'd been parked on dry asphalt all day, and there was no creek near the shop. They were in a row, evenly spaced, precisely placed. I sold the shop 6 weeks later without setting foot on that road again. The buyer asked why I was so motivated to move quickly. I told him I had obligations in Austin, which wasn't untrue. I never told him about the road. I don't know if that makes me a coward or just practical. Either way, I think about those stones sometimes. I think about the patience in how they were placed. Story 2. Growing up in the Ozarks, you learn early that the hills have a way of keeping secrets. Not in a poetic sense, just literally. A holler can be half a mile from a main road and feel completely unreachable, cut off by terrain that doesn't care about your schedule or your phone signal. My grandmother's property sat at the back of one of those hollows, accessible by a single-lane dirt road that flooded 3 or 4 times a year and required a vehicle with actual ground clearance. She lived back there for 60 years. When she passed, my mother and I drove up from Springfield to sort through the house. I should say I was 34 at the time, old enough to know better than to go wandering around in strange terrain at night, young enough to think I was exempt from that advice. My mother is the practical one. She had a list, she worked through the list, she stayed focused. I'm more like my grandmother, apparently. I'd find something interesting and follow it for an hour before remembering I was supposed to be somewhere else. The property was 40 acres, most of it wooded. My grandmother had maintained a kitchen garden and a small orchard, both gone to weeds now, and beyond the orchard there was a meadow that backed up to a hillside dense with second-growth oak and hickory. She told me once, when I was maybe 8, not to go past the meadow after dark. I'd asked why, and she'd said because things come down from the hill at night, and I'd assumed she meant deer. The first afternoon we were there, I walked the orchard. The apple trees were overgrown but still fruiting, small hard apples that smelled fermented where they'd fallen. I found an old fence line, half collapsed, running back toward the tree line. I found a rusted watering can. I found a ceramic garden gnome that must have been 30 years old, faded almost to nothing, still standing upright in the weeds like it was doing its job. That gnome bothered me more than it should have, seeing it out there in the tall grass with its painted smile worn down to almost nothing. We worked until evening and slept in the house, my mother in my grandmother's room, me on the couch. The couch smelled like cedar and something floral, lavender maybe, and I lay awake longer than I should have listening to the hollow settle. Old houses make noise, I knew that. But the noises that house made were conversational, rhythmic, almost call and response. I told myself it was just the way sound traveled in a narrow valley. The second morning, I noticed the mud near the garden gate. It had rained briefly the night before, and the soil near the gate was soft and dark, and there were tracks in it. I'm no tracker. I want to be upfront about that. But I could see that something had walked up to the garden gate and stood there, and the impression of whatever had stood there was large and roughly bipedal and pressed deep, like whatever left it was heavy. There were no prints leading to where the standing impression was. None, just the standing spot and then the prints walking away toward the orchard. I showed my mother. She looked at it for a moment, said it was probably a bear, and went back inside. I stood there for another few minutes thinking about how bears walk on all fours most of the time. But I also don't know much about bears, and I needed to believe the explanation, so I let it land. The thing I can't let land, the thing I still haven't found a framework for, was what happened the second night. I woke up around 2. No reason, no noise, just awake with that specific alertness. That means your body decided something before your brain caught up. I lay still for a moment and then I heard it, someone singing outside near the orchard. Low and meandering, not a song I recognized, the kind of tune that sounds improvised, and it was my grandmother's voice. Her exact voice, the particular hoarse quality she'd had in her last years, the slight flatness on the lower notes that was just hers. She'd been dead for 3 weeks. I want to tell you I did something brave or sensible. What I actually did was pull the blanket over my head and stop breathing and wait. The singing went on for maybe 5 minutes, then it stopped. Then there was a long silence, then a single knock on the exterior wall of the house, maybe 6 feet from where I was lying, so measured and deliberate it might as well have been a greeting. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sun came up, I went outside. The ceramic garden gnome I'd found in the weeds was now on the porch railing, centered, upright, facing the door. I hadn't moved it. My mother swore she hadn't either. We finished the house that morning and drove back to Springfield by noon. My mother said I looked like I hadn't slept, which was accurate. She didn't ask why. Some things in that family we understood to let alone. I've thought about what was singing out by the orchard. I think about what it would have taken to learn her voice well enough to replicate it down to those small imperfections. I think about what would want to. And sometimes, not often, I think about my grandmother telling me things come down from the hill at night. She lived back there for 60 years. She knew exactly what she was telling me. Story 3. The summer I turned 22, I took a job with a small environmental survey crew working out of western Montana. The pay was decent, the schedule was brutal, and I had just graduated with a biology degree and exactly no full-time prospects, so when a professor of mine forwarded me a contract position, I signed it inside of 24 hours without reading most of it. That was the first decision I'd make that summer I would later regret. The crew was 4 people, including me, Desmond Park, who ran the operation with the kind of calm efficiency that suggested he'd been doing field work since before I was born. Yuki Tanaka, who was completing her master's thesis and had the particular intensity of someone who has staked everything on a single outcome. And a man named Garrett Hollies, who mostly operated the equipment and never seemed to be without a travel mug of bad coffee. I was the junior field tech, which meant I did whatever the other 3 needed and tried to learn fast. We were surveying riparian vegetation along a series of creek drainages in a roadless area about 40 miles from the nearest paved road. Access was by a rough 2-track that required high clearance and 4-wheel drive, and once we were in, no cell service, satellite communicator for emergencies. It was the most remote I'd ever worked, and for the first week I thought it was the best thing that had ever happened to me. The camp was functional. We had 2 large canvas tents, a cook tent with a camp stove, a hand-pump water filter, folding chairs. Desmond had been running crews in this country for years, and he set camp with the efficiency of someone who had refined the process down to nothing extraneous. Garrett had rigged a small solar array to keep the equipment batteries charged. Yuki had a specific way of organizing her sample containers that she explained to me on day 2 with the warning that if I disturbed her system, she would have words. I never disturbed her system. The drainage we were working was beautiful in a harsh way, braided channels through cobble bars, willows dense along the banks, the hills above running from sage steppe to dark conifer as you gained elevation. Desmond pointed out signs of ungulate activity everywhere, the kind of country that should be full of motion. But it was. Twice in the first week I noticed it, places where the vegetation was thick and cover was good and you'd expect to flush something, a deer, a grouse, something, and there was nothing. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was evacuated. I mentioned it to Garrett on day 6 and he gave me a look over his travel mug and said, "Yeah, Desmond knows." That was all he said, and I didn't push it, which I probably should have. The discovery that broke the equilibrium was Yuki's. She was sampling a side drainage about a quarter mile from camp when she found what she initially thought were trail blazes, marks cut into the bark of the conifer trees at intervals along the drainage, roughly chest height, a series of long parallel gouges that went deep into the wood. She called it in on the radio, and Desmond and I went to look. The gouges were too regular for an animal and too irregular for a tool. Each set was 4 parallel lines, the spacing consistent, and they ran the full length of the drainage on both banks, maybe half a mile, maybe more. Something had marked every significant tree. The cuts were fresh. The exposed wood was still pale, not darkened by oxidation. Whatever made them had done it recently. Desmond looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he said we should note the location and continue working, and that was that. That night was when I first heard the movement outside camp. I'd been awake anyway, reading by headlamp. I was partway through a paperback I'd grabbed from a gas station, a thriller set on a submarine, entirely disconnected from where I was. The sound was footsteps. Unhurried, deliberate, a full circuit around the perimeter of camp, maybe 15 or 20 feet outside the tree line. I sat up and listened, and the footsteps completed their circuit and stopped. I looked out the tent door. Nothing. Dark tree line, stars above it, the creek murmuring behind camp. It happened again the next night, and the night after. On the 4th night, Garrett was already awake when I came out of my tent. He was sitting in one of the folding chairs with his travel mug, not the satellite communicator, not a flashlight, just sitting. I sat next to him. We listened to it complete its circuit. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. "Since about night 3, he said. "Desmond hears it too." "What do we do?" He shrugged. "We're leaving in 6 days. We finished the survey." I tried to think of what Desmond might know that made 6 days seem manageable, and I couldn't find it. On the 5th night, whatever was circling camp came closer. I heard the sound change, less leaf litter, more the compression of bare soil, and then it stopped directly behind my tent, and I became aware that there was something on the other side of the canvas. Not touching it, just there. I could feel the presence of it the way you can sometimes feel someone standing behind you before you see them. The canvas was an inch from my face. I held absolutely still for 4 minutes. I counted. Then the footsteps resumed and pulled away. In the morning, I found the marks in the soil behind my tent. Foot impressions, nearly human in shape, but the stride length was wrong, far too long, each step separated from the last by nearly 5 feet. Whatever moved with those steps would have to be long-limbed in ways that exceeded any architecture I had reference for. We broke camp on schedule 6 days later. Desmond never said a word about it. Yuki noted the bark markings in her survey data as unknown mammalian sign. Garrett drove out without looking in his mirrors. I still have the photos I took of those footprints. I've shown them to exactly one person who suggested a bear walking upright. The stride length ruled that out. The shape ruled that out. I stopped showing them after that. Some measurements don't have good answers. Story 4. My family has owned land in the Mississippi Hill Country for 4 generations, and for 4 generations the back 30 acres have sat unused. When I ask my Aunt Colleen about it, she's the one who keeps the family records, the one who knows where the deeds are. She gets this particular expression, not fear exactly, more like the careful neutrality of someone who has decided not to talk about something. She'll say the land is wet, which it is. She'll say it's not worth developing, which it probably is. What she won't say is what my great-uncle told her, which is what he told me directly the winter before he died. Don't walk the back 30 after the first frost. I grew up with that prohibition the way you grow up with any family rule. It just exists, unchallengeable, texture of the background. I followed it through my childhood and my teens and most of my 20s. Then my great-uncle died and left me a portion of the property, and I was 31 and grown, and I needed to know the extent of what I'd inherited. I went in late November. First frost had come and gone 2 weeks before, so I was already in violation of the rule, and I want to be honest that I knew that. I wasn't being accidentally careless. I was being deliberate. I was 31 and I needed to know. The back 30 starts where the maintained pasture ends, past a rusted wire fence I had to step through carefully. The terrain drops into a creek bottom and then climbs a series of low ridges dense with hardwood, oak, sweetgum, persimmon still holding its fruit, orange and wrinkled. The light was flat and gray. I had good boots, a thermos of coffee that tasted off in a way I couldn't identify, almost like minerals, like copper. And I'd told my cousin Trina I was going back there and would be out by 3. The first hour was unremarkable. Beautiful even in that bare November way when you can see the bones of a forest through the stripped branches. I found the foundation of a structure I hadn't known existed, maybe 10 feet square, stone walls collapsed down to knee height. The interior was full of dead leaves. Whatever it had been was too small for a house. A smokehouse, maybe, or a spring house. I tried to photograph it with my phone, but the camera kept focusing on something in the middle distance rather than the stone, like it kept finding an edge there that wasn't visible to me. I found the creek at the low point of the property, broader than I expected, moving dark and slow over clay bottom. On the far bank, a stand of river birch, their white bark luminous in the gray light. I crossed on a log and started up the far ridge. The cold deepened as I climbed. That's not unusual. Temperature inversions, low spots hold cold. But this cold had a quality to it that felt directional, like it was coming from somewhere specific rather than just settling. I stopped about 2/3 up the ridge and turned around, not sure why, and scanned the creek bottom below me. There was something standing near the birch trees. At first I put it with the trees themselves. Pale, vertical, roughly human in outline, and then it moved. And the movement was the part I couldn't reassign. It was moving parallel to the creek, slowly, passing between the birch trunks, and it was pale the way bare winter branches are pale. But it was moving wrong for a branch, moving wrong for a person, moving with a quality of patience that made me think of the way a current moves, continuous and purposeful, and without the micro-adjustments that living things make when they walk. I watched it until the birch stand ended and it went out of my sightline. I stood on the ridge for a while. I didn't go back down. I climbed to the ridgeline and worked my way around the back of the property along the high ground, keeping the creek bottom below and to my left, and came out at the far corner of the pasture and walked back along the fence line to the house. I called Colleen that evening. I described what I'd seen, trying to be measured about it, trying not to sound like I was asking her to validate something I was already afraid of. There was a long pause on her end. Then she said, "There's a reason Daddy said after the first frost. Before the frost, it sleeps." I asked her how she knew. Because he walked back there in the summer for 40 years and nothing ever happened, she said. And he walked back there in November once, and that was enough. I haven't been back to the property since. The land is in a trust now. Colleen manages it. Last spring she sent me a photograph, unsolicited, no message, just the photo. It showed the camera facing the creek bottom on a clear spring morning. In the birch stand there was what looked like a shed skin caught in the lower branches, a translucent film, large, roughly the shape of something that had hung there and then moved on. She didn't explain it. She knew I'd understand. Story 5. The road up to the Sunderland mine site had been gated since 1987, which meant the padlock was a specific vintage of rust that would break under pressure if you knew where to apply it. My friend Rowan Akeb and I were 24, and we knew exactly where to apply pressure on rusted padlocks, which is the kind of knowledge you accumulate when you grow up rural and bored, and convinced that every locked gate is just an invitation with extra steps. The mine was copper, played out by the mid-80s. The company had sealed the shafts with concrete plugs and put up the gate, and that was the end of it officially. Unofficially, the site still had a half-dozen timber frame structures in various states of collapse, an ore processing building, a machine shed, the remains of a bunkhouse, and the ruins were exactly what 24-year-olds who had watched too many YouTube urbex channels considered a destination. We went in mid-September on a Saturday. I want to be precise about that because I spent some time afterward trying to figure out exactly how many hours we were up there, and the math never quite came out right. We started up the road around 10 in the morning. I had a camera, Rowan had a flashlight the size of a small club. We'd brought sandwiches and water, everything sensible people bring. The road was 2 miles of uneven dirt climbing through lodgepole pine, and it was a beautiful day, clear and cool, the kind of September day in the Mountain West that makes you feel like everything is exactly as it should be. The mine site opened up at the end of the road, a flat bench cut into the hillside, the structures clustered at the back. The view east was extraordinary, the valley laid out below us, the mountains on the far side still holding a thin stripe of last year's snow. I took about 30 photographs of the view before we'd even started exploring the buildings. Rowan made fun of me for this. I ate half my sandwich standing in the sun because it seemed like the right moment for it. The ore processing building was the largest structure, maybe 60 feet long, 2 stories, the roof partially gone. Inside, the equipment had been stripped, but the bones of the operation were still there. Conveyor frames, sorting tables, the concrete pads where the heavy machinery had sat. It smelled like rust and cold stone and something faintly organic I couldn't place. Rowan went up the half-collapsed staircase to the second floor while I documented the ground level. That was when I found the arrangement. In the corner of the building farthest from the door, on one of the old sorting tables, someone had placed a grid of small objects. Bolt heads, pieces of wire, fragments of copper ore, all arranged in a pattern, rows and columns, each object the same distance from its neighbors, the whole thing covering maybe 2 feet square. The care of it was what got me. Out here, no maintenance, no visitors officially, and someone had made this. Recently, the objects weren't dusty the way everything else in the building was dusty. The copper fragments still had a faint metallic sheen. I called Rowan down. He looked at it for a while and said it was probably kids. Probably true. We moved on. We spent maybe 3 hours on the site going through each structure. The bunkhouse was the most intact, and the most unsettling personal items still there, the previous occupants having left in a hurry when the mine closed, and 40 years of decay laid over everything. A boot, a coffee mug, a calendar from 1986 that I photographed because the dates were still clear. One room had a mattress that had been dragged to the center of the floor, and something, I decided it was water damage, had left a large, dark stain around it, spreading out in an irregular shape. We started back down around 3. We were both feeling something by then, a tiredness that felt disproportionate, like we'd been out for 8 hours instead of 5. I was quiet in a way that wasn't my natural state, and Rowan was too, and we walked most of the 2 miles to the gate without talking, which for Rowan is genuinely unusual. About a mile down, I stopped walking, just stopped without deciding to. There was something watching us from the uphill side of the road. I can't give you more than that, because what I saw, my brain kept trying to reassign to the shadows between the lodgepole trunks, the pale shape of bark, the irregular depth of shadows, the way light moved when the wind moved the canopy above. But it wasn't bark and it wasn't shadow because it blinked, not with eyelids. The shape of the pale thing in the shadows closed and reformed, like a lamp being briefly switched off, and the darkness in that moment was absolute. I said, "Rowan," very quietly. He stopped. He looked where I was looking. He put his hand on my arm. We walked the rest of the way to the gate at a pace that was technically walking, and then we were in the truck, and I drove down to the main road and pulled out and pointed us toward town. When I got home that night and put my camera's memory card in my laptop, I found something in the last photograph I'd taken of the site overview, the wide shot looking back at the buildings from the road as we left. In the doorway of the ore processing building, standing in the shadow just inside the entrance, there was a figure, upright, long. The shadow obscured all of it except the proportions, which were wrong. I'd looked at that doorway when I took the picture. It was empty. Story 6. Some roads you can feel are wrong before you can say why. US 491 through the Navajo Nation has its own specific quality of vastness that I don't mean as criticism. It's honest land. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. But the county roads that branch off it, heading into the arroyos and the Red Rock breaks, some of those have a different quality. I was 37 when I found one of them, which surprised me because I'd been driving the area for 10 years on and off. First for a surveying job, and then later just because I liked the land. Her name was Claudette Morrow, and she'd grown up in the area and now worked for the county assessor's office. We met at a municipal meeting about road maintenance, and ended up having a 3-hour conversation about the geology of the Colorado Plateau over terrible coffee. And somewhere in that conversation, I mentioned that I'd been trying to find a natural arch I'd seen referenced in a 1970s BLM report. She knew the arch. She also knew the road that went toward it, and when I said I was planning to go look, she got a specific expression, not quite the expression my aunt makes, but in the same family, and said she'd come along. I was glad she came. I want to say that because the story makes me sound grateful for her presence in a way I didn't fully appreciate until afterward. We took my truck, a high-clearance 4-wheel drive, and turned off the main road onto a county road that immediately narrowed to single lane and began climbing into a Red Rock canyon. The color of the stone was extraordinary deep umber and ochre, stained with manganese black in the drainages, veined with white caliche. My phone lost service within a mile. Claudette had a paper topo she'd pulled from an old county map, and she navigated from that, which I found both charming and practical. The arch was about 6 miles in. We found it on a side drainage, a span of maybe 40 feet, sandstone worn thin by centuries of freeze-thaw, the sky visible through it in a rectangle of pure blue. I took photographs. Claudette sat on a boulder nearby and ate an apple and seemed content to let me be excited about it. The wind moved through the canyon with a sound like sustained exhalation. That sound was still there when the wind stopped. I noticed it because the wind died, that definite shift from moving air to still air that you feel on your skin, but the sound persisted. the exhalation sound, coming from somewhere below us. I looked at Claudette. She was already looking toward the drainage below the arch. Her apple was held halfway to her mouth and not moving. "Does this canyon have a cave system?" I asked. "Not on the survey," she said. We listened. The sound modulated, varied in a way that wind doesn't vary, a way that suggested, and I know how this sounds, something drawing breath. Then it stopped. Complete silence. We did not go to look. I want to be clear that this was a mutual and unspoken decision, the kind you make with another person without any words passing between you. We took the photographs I'd come for and we walked back to the truck. We were about 3 miles down the road on the way out when the figure appeared on the canyon rim above us. I only saw it for a few seconds. It was standing on the rim, looking down at the road, backlit by the sky, but in those seconds I could see it was tall and very still, and its shadow fell down the canyon face in a way that was too long for the angle of the sun. I kept driving. I didn't slow down or point. Claudette was looking at it too. We both watched it in the peripheral vision, and neither of us turned to look directly, which in retrospect was either instinct or courtesy, and I don't know which. It was gone when I checked the rearview mirror, Claudette said as we reached the paved road, and I felt my shoulders drop about 2 inches. My grandmother would know what that was. I asked if she'd tell me. "No," she said, and then after a pause, she'd say you shouldn't have pictures of the arch. I still have the photographs. I've never done anything with them. Every so often I open the folder and look at them, and the arch is beautiful in every shot. In 3 of the photographs, at the edge of the frame, there's a shape at the top of the canyon rim that I can't account for. It's not the same shape in each photograph, which bothers me more than if it were. Something up there was moving. Story 7. I was not supposed to be on the Kern River Road after dark, and I knew it, and I went anyway because I'm the kind of person who needs to learn things firsthand rather than from the experience of others, which has historically cost me more than it saved me. My girlfriend at the time, Simona Demi, would tell you exactly that. She told me before I left, in fact. She said, "If you're not back by midnight, I'm calling your brother." I said I'd be back by 10. It was one of those impulsive road trips I used to take. Just start driving south from Fresno, see where I end up. I was 28 and recently out of a stressful job, and I needed movement more than destination. I had a tank of gas, a bag of road snacks that were mostly just corn chips, and a playlist I'd been meaning to listen to for weeks. The Kern River Road shadows the river through a canyon of granite and pine, and in late August the light stays long and the canyon has this cathedral quality that I'd been meaning to revisit since a rafting trip 5 years prior. I stopped at a turnout to watch the last of the light leave the canyon. I had my windows down and I could smell the river, cold water and sun-warmed granite, that specific combination that smells like summer in the Sierra. I ate some corn chips. I was perfectly content. I should have turned around then. I kept going south instead, thinking I'd reach the small town at the canyon's end, get a coffee and drive back. The town was further than I remembered. Night came fast once the canyon walls blocked the horizon. The road is 2 lanes wide and winds with the river, requiring attention, and I was giving it attention, which is why I noticed immediately when the river changed. For a mile or so, the road ran along a flat section where the river spread wide and shallow over a gravel bar. I'd been watching the glimmer of water to my right. Then I realized the glimmer was gone. The river was still there, I could hear it, but the normal nighttime luminosity of moving water had stopped. The water looked black and absolutely still, which isn't what a shallow gravel bar section does. It was like looking at a hole. I pulled over, sat with the windows down, listening. The river was moving, I could hear it upstream and downstream, but right beside me, nothing. And then from across the river, from the far bank where the granite rose in sheets, a sound came out of the dark. Not a voice, not an animal, a tone, a sustained, resonant tone that seemed to be coming from inside the stone itself, vibrating at a frequency I felt in my back molars. It lasted for about 10 seconds, then stopped. Then came again, slightly different in pitch, from a different place along the far bank. I turned my headlights on. I'd been sitting with just running lights, and in the headlights the river surface was still wrong, still black and still, and on the far bank the granite was pale in the light and I could see nothing, no shapes, no movement, but the tone came a third time, and this time it was behind me, from the trees on my side of the road, and it was close. I pulled out and drove. I want to tell you I drove normally, but I drove at 80 on a canyon road at night, which is not safe, and I don't recommend it, and I am genuinely lucky to have survived the drive out independent of anything else. The thing I found when I got home, Simone was still up, sitting at the kitchen table with her phone, was the corn chip bag on the passenger seat. I'd left it on the seat. When I picked it up, I found that someone had folded the top of the bag down neatly, twice, the way you fold a bag to keep something fresh, like something in the car had been tidying up. Simone asked if I was okay. I said yes. I didn't tell her about the bag for 3 months. When I finally did, she sat with it for a long time, and then she said, "The car doors were locked the whole time, weren't they?" They were. I checked immediately, obsessively, in the parking lot of the first gas station I reached after the canyon. The doors had been locked. The windows had been closed before I got in. I don't know what to do with that. I have not found a framework that holds it. Story 8. My sister Priya and I went back to our family's summer cabin for the first time in 11 years, the summer she turned 40. Our parents had sold it after our father's stroke, a practical decision. They couldn't make the drive anymore, and the cabin required constant maintenance. And somehow neither of us had made it back to that part of the Adirondacks since. When Priya turned 40, she got nostalgic in a way I wasn't expecting and booked 2 weeks at a rental property about 3 miles from the old cabin. She said she wanted to see the lake. She said she wanted to remember the place as it was when we were kids. I said sure, because I wanted the same thing, and also because I'm the kind of person who can't say no to my sister. The rental was fine, a modern A-frame with a dock. The lake was the same lake, the same quality of cold and dark blue that I'd swum in every August between ages 8 and 16. The road into the rental area was bordered by birch and maple, and the first afternoon we arrived, I went for a walk on the old trail that I remembered running as a child. It was familiar in the specific way that childhood places are familiar. The scale is different when you're grown, everything's smaller, but the shapes of things persist. The third day, we decided to walk to the old cabin. The property had changed hands twice since our parents sold it. We weren't planning to knock on the door, just walk the road past it, see the exterior. A pilgrimage, the kind of thing you do when you're 40 and feeling the particular pull of your own history. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, and as we walked I recognized individual trees, a split maple I used to climb, a white birch with an unusual double trunk. Priya was quieter than usual. I think we were both feeling the weight of time. The cabin looked wrong. It was structurally the same footprint, same roof line, but the yard was overgrown in a way that suggested more than seasonal neglect. The windows were dark. The dock, visible at the end of the path through the trees, was still there but listing. The current owners either weren't using it much or weren't there. There was a car in the drive, an old Subaru with a cracked windshield that looked like it hadn't moved in some time. We stood at the edge of the property and looked at it. Priya said it seemed sad. I agreed. Then we heard the sound from inside the cabin. It was rhythmic, too rhythmic for something accidental, a slow, measured knock repeated at intervals. Not frantic, not like someone trying to get out. Patient. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks, a pause, like a signal, like something waiting to be acknowledged. Priya grabbed my arm. We stood there and the knocking continued, and then on about the fourth or fifth cycle of it, it was joined by a second sound, different in pitch, coming from the far end of the cabin. Also 3-beat, also measured, and I had the sudden vertiginous sense that whatever was producing these sounds was doing so collaboratively, that there were two of them and that the sounds were meant for us specifically, standing at the edge of the property. We backed up, turned around, walked back to the rental at a pace that felt controlled even though it wasn't, and didn't talk until we were inside with the door locked. Later that afternoon, when we both calmed down somewhat, Priya said she wanted to go look in the window of the cabin. I said no. She said it was probably just an animal inside, pipes something. I said maybe, and I meant it in the way you say something to close a conversation rather than because you believe it. The sounds had been too coordinated for one animal. They'd been too deliberate for pipes. What I found the next morning on the rental's dock, our dock for the rental 3 miles away, was a small pile of stones and a single feather arranged on the dock's edge. The feather was long, dark, iridescent, the kind from a bird I couldn't identify. The stones were smooth and rounded, the kind from a stream bed, and there was no stream within a mile of the rental property. We left 4 days early. Priya said she needed to get back to the city. I didn't argue. The lake, the drive back out, all of it was beautiful. The Adirondacks are genuinely beautiful. But the whole drive out, I kept thinking about the two rhythms and how they'd matched each other and what kind of communication that implied. Story 9. I'll be honest with you. I took the job on the North Dakota oil patch because I needed the money and I wasn't in a position to be choosy about where I went for it. This was maybe 7 years ago. I was 29, I'd just come off a rough year, and a guy I'd worked construction with mentioned they were hiring equipment operators out of Williston, and the pay was exceptional, and the schedule was 21 days on, 7 days off. I signed up. The work was hard and the country was stark, and I grew to respect it. The prairie in North Dakota is not nothing. People say it's empty, but it's just honest about what it is: big sky and flat land and the particular silence of somewhere wind-scoured. The crew I worked with was a good group. There was a man named Ezekiel Forrester who operated the drill site next to mine, and we ate most of our meals together and played cards in the evenings, and became the kind of friends you become when you're isolated with someone in a demanding place. The thing that happened on a night in my third rotation in late October. Our site was about 12 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible by a gravel 2-track that the company graders maintained in good weather. In bad weather you were there until conditions improved, which was part of the deal. That October had been warm and dry, and the road was fine, and there was no reason for me to be stranded. I was there late because a hydraulic line had needed emergency attention, and I was the one on shift. The repair took until around 9 at night. The rest of the crew had gone back to the camp trailers at the main site, a mile down the road. I drove that mile in the equipment truck, a beat-up F-250 with a cracked dash, and I was about halfway when the headlights illuminated something standing in the middle of the road. My first thought was cattle. Ranches ran cattle all through this country, and fence lines failed constantly, and a stray cow on a back road at night was not unusual. My second thought, following almost immediately as my headlights registered the shape more precisely, was that it wasn't cattle. It was upright, thin in a way that cattle aren't, pale in a way that cattle aren't, a pale that my headlights made almost luminescent. It was facing away from me, facing east along the road, and it was tall. The top of it was at the height of my headlights, which sat higher than a normal car, and it still cleared them. I stopped, sat there. It turned its head, not its body, just its head, and too far. The rotation went far past what a neck can normally do until the face was directed back at me over the spine. The face was long and narrow, and the eyes were set deep in shadow, and I could not see them. Only the impression of depth where they should have been. It turned its head that way and regarded me for what I can only describe as a long time, though it was probably seconds, and then turned its head back and stepped off the road into the field and was gone. I drove to the camp trailers. I sat in the truck for a while before going in. Ezekiel was awake making coffee, and he said I looked like I'd seen a ghost, which is a phrase that would have seemed more clever in different circumstances. I told him what I'd seen. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he said, "The guys at the Larson site 2 months ago had something similar. Night shift." I asked if they'd reported it. He looked at me over his coffee. "What would you put in the report?" He had a point. In the morning, in daylight, I drove the section of road where it had been. In the dry grass beside the road, the ground was pressed down in a trail that moved from where the figure had stepped off the road into the field, heading east. The pressed-down grass trail went about 50 yards and then just stopped. There was no disturbance beyond that point, no trail picking back up. Whatever made the trail had been moving and then simply wasn't anymore. I worked 2 more rotations after that before I found a different job. I needed the money, but I needed sleep more, and I stopped being able to sleep. Some nights I'd lie awake in the camp trailer and think about that head rotation, how much further it had gone than anatomy permitted, and wonder what the logistics of that meant. What the internal structure of something that did that would look like. I never found a satisfying answer. I stopped looking for one after a while. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. They're just meant to be lived with. Story 10. The thing about old mining towns in the Nevada desert is that they die without ceremony. There's no official end, no announcement, people just stop coming and the structures start returning to the landscape. And within a generation, the place exists mostly as a collection of GPS coordinates in a hobbyist's database. Blackhorn, Nevada was one of those, a silver camp that had seen maybe 400 people in its peak years in the 1880s and then been empty for over a century. I found the coordinates in an abandoned mine enthusiast forum and drove out on a Thursday, because Thursday is my day off and I had no better plans. My name is Tomas Bellacourt. I'm a high school earth science teacher from Elko. I drive out to old sites on my days off because the geology is instructive and I like being alone in open country. I am a practical person. I don't believe in things I haven't seen. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the disposition I went in with. The site was 50 miles from the main highway on a dirt road that my GPS eventually gave up tracking, at which point I navigated by the coordinates on my phone. The country was basin and range, low sagebrush broken by rocky ridges, the sky enormous and white with heat. I brought 6 liters of water, my lunch, a camera, a first aid kit, and a notebook for geological observations. I parked where the road gave out and hiked the last half mile to the town site. The site was exactly what the forum had described: adobe and stone foundations in various states of collapse, the remains of what might have been a hotel or general store at the center, a scatter of smaller foundations radiating from it, everything the color of the desert because everything had been made from the desert. The afternoon light was low and golden and beautiful, and the whole scene had the peaceful quality of something that had made its peace. I spent about 2 hours documenting geological notes, altered volcanic rock in the walls suggesting hydrothermal activity, which would explain why someone had mined here, quartz veins, some malachite staining. I found part of an old bottle in green glass worn smooth by a century of weather. I found a square nail. I found a ceramic fragment, off-white, possibly a plate. I found a boot heel leather, almost completely desiccated, that I photographed and left exactly where it was. The shadows were lengthening, and I was getting ready to head back to the car when I found the circle. It was in what had been the interior of the largest structure on the compacted earth floor. Not drawn, made from objects pressed into the soil. Small bones arranged in a precise circle about 4 feet across. The bones were bird bones, mostly the small bones of wing joints and feet, and they were clean and pale and recent. In the center of the circle, a single longer bone, a leg bone probably from something the size of a rabbit, laid horizontally, pointing east. I stood at the edge of it and thought about what I was looking at. The careful part of my brain wanted to do science on it, recent, maybe within the last week or two, intentional arrangement, not natural scatter, consistent species, suggesting deliberate collection. The other part of my brain was filing a quieter complaint. I photographed it and started back. I was about 20 minutes from the car, moving through the sagebrush, when I realized I was not alone in the flat. I can't tell you what made me realize it. The landscape was completely open. I could see in every direction for a quarter mile. There was nothing visible, but I had the absolute bone-deep certainty of being accompanied, of something moving with me at a distance I couldn't detect. The sage smelled sharp in the cooling air. My footsteps seemed too loud. I tried to move faster without running, the way you do when you're deciding whether to be scared, and twice I thought I caught motion in the corner of my eye, low to the ground, quick peripheral that vanished when I turned. Not an animal. Animals in this country move in ways I know. This was something else, something that seemed to understand sightlines, that was staying just outside of direct vision. I reached the car. I got in. I drove. I got home well after dark and sat in my kitchen for a while before I went to bed. I'm a practical person. I wrote in my notebook, bone arrangement at site recent, possible ritualistic context, coordinate future research. That was the practical response. What I found on the driver's side of my car the next morning when I went out to drive to school was the longer bone from the center of the circle, the one that had been pointing east. It was on the dashboard, inside the locked car, pointing east. I have not found a practical framework for that. Story 11. Somewhere in the hill country between the Red River and the Arkansas state line, there's a stretch of road that locals in that part of Oklahoma call the Cut. It's not on most maps by that name. Officially, it's just a county road, single-lane blacktop, cutting through a ridge where someone in the 1930s made a decision about topography and created a notch through a limestone hillside, maybe 20 feet of exposed cliff on either side, and then open again. You're through it in 10 seconds, but it has a reputation in the area that I grew up hearing about and mostly ignored until the summer I was 38. My name is Hazel Brinkworth. I'd grown up in that county, left at 18, came back at 38 to care for my mother through a long illness, and found myself reacquainting with roads I'd known as a child and half forgotten. The Cut was on my route to and from the nearest larger town, and I drove it regularly, and in the daytime it was just a feature of the local landscape. At night I avoided it. That was instinct, not decision. I can't tell you when I started avoiding it at night because I have no memory of making the choice. I just realized one day that I'd been routing around it in the dark without ever consciously deciding to. My mother passed in June. I stayed another 2 months to settle the estate, and there was a night in late July. I don't remember exactly what date, the weeks were blurring together by then, when I drove back from town after dark and went through the Cut without thinking, just took the direct route instead of the longer way around, because I was tired and not paying attention to habits. Halfway through the Cut, my headlights failed, not gradually, not a flicker, just off simultaneously as though they'd been switched off by a hand. The engine kept running, I could feel it through the wheel, but I was in absolute darkness in a confined space, limestone walls on either side, traveling at 40 miles an hour. I braked and stopped, which was the right thing to do, and sat there in the dark with my foot on the brake and my hazard lights, which still worked, clicking their dim orange pulse through the cab. Outside the car, the darkness was total. No moonlight reached into the Cut. I could hear my own breathing. I sat for maybe 2 minutes not moving, thinking about whether I should get out or stay in the car. The hazard lights gave me enough light to see the dashboard, the steering wheel, my own hands, nothing else. Then something touched the car from the outside. Not a touch, a pressure, sustained and slow, like something leaning its weight against the driver's side door, and the car shifted slightly on its suspension as something took on that weight. I could hear the creak of it. And then, very close to my window on the other side of the glass, I heard breathing. Not an animal sound, a person sound, the slow, deep breath of something large and patient, inches from my ear. I did not look to my left. This was not courage or strategy. It was the paralysis of a body that has made a decision before the mind has caught up. I stared straight ahead at the dark limestone of the far end of the cut. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds. Then the pressure released from the car door. I felt the suspension spring back and the headlights came on. I drove out the far end of the cut and did not stop again for 4 miles. When I looked at the driver's side door the next morning, there was a handprint in the dust on the door's surface. Large, palm and 5 fingers pressed flat. The handprint was a little too large for a human hand, and the spacing of the fingers was not quite right. I photographed it before the next rain washed it away. I have not driven through the cut since. I don't believe I ever will. Story 12. The trail to Prospect Creek isn't in any hiking guide, which should have told me something. I found it on an old USGS topo map from the 1960s that I'd picked up at an estate sale, folded into the back of a box of similar maps I'd bought because I'm the kind of person who buys estate sale maps. The trail was marked as a proposed access route, dashed rather than solid. The kind of mark that means the intention existed, but the thing itself may not have followed. I decided to go see what was there. My hiking partner that day was a woman named Leonora Vasquez, who I'd met in a hiking club and who had the remarkable quality of never being afraid of anything for reasons I'd never fully understood. She was 51. She'd hiked in Patagonia, the Karakoram, the Alaskan interior. A proposed trail in the Virginia Blue Ridge was not going to give Leonora pause. We found the trailhead where the topo suggested, a gap in the laurel thicket off a Forest Service road, marked by a cairn that looked decades old. The trail beyond it was real but faint, the kind of trail that's maintained by foot traffic alone and reverts to scrub as soon as the foot traffic stops. Overgrown in places, clear in others. We'd both worn long pants for the Laurel Scramble, and I was glad for that immediately. The first mile was standard Blue Ridge, mixed hardwood, mountain laurel, occasional views through the trees toward the valley below. A moderate descent toward the creek bottom. I found a turkey feather. Leonora found a piece of field tile that suggested agriculture had reached this hollow at some point, which we both found interesting and discussed for longer than was probably warranted. The creek was beautiful when we reached it. Small, clear, running over slate ledges in a series of small falls. The water the color of weak tea from tannins. We ate lunch on a flat rock in the sun. I had my usual hiking lunch, which is crackers and cheese and an apple, and the apple had gotten slightly mealy in my pack, which was a disappointment I noted and moved on from. Leonora had a series of small containers from her pack that turned out to contain an elaborate collection of marinated things and small cheeses, which she assembled with the calm efficiency of someone who has long ago accepted that she is a better packer than anyone she hikes with. We started upstream after lunch, following the creek, looking for the feature the map suggested was there, a waterfall marked on the top or at the top of the drainage. The creek narrowed as we climbed, the valley walls steepening, the hardwoods giving way to hemlock that filtered the light to a green dimness. The temperature dropped noticeably. I zipped my jacket. It was Leonora who first noticed the silence. She stopped walking and stood still for a moment and then said quietly, "The creek noise stopped." She was right. The creek was still there beside us, still moving. I could see the water, but I couldn't hear it. The sound of moving water had simply ceased, as though I'd gone deaf for a specific frequency. I tested this by listening hard. I could hear the wind in the hemlocks, my own breathing, the distant thump of a woodpecker, just not the creek. We looked at each other. Leonora, who never expresses fear, looked thoughtful and slightly attentive in a way I'd never seen from her before. Then she pointed up the slope to the left. Someone had strung a line between two hemlock trunks, maybe 20 feet up the slope from the creek. From the line hung a series of objects, the pale blue and gray of bird eggs, blown and hanging on thread, and between them smaller objects I couldn't identify at distance. We climbed to it. The smaller objects were teeth. Animal teeth, I think, though the size varied in a way that was hard to account for. The thread was old, not ancient, but weathered. The eggs darkened on their lower hemispheres where moisture had been collecting. But the line itself was taut, recently retied or replaced. We stood looking at it for a while without touching it. Then Leonora said, practically, "We should go back." I agreed. On the way out, we heard the thing in the hemlock above us. Not on the slope, in the trees themselves, a movement through the canopy, branch to branch, at a weight and speed that didn't correspond to any bird I know. It followed the creek line, moving parallel to us, keeping pace. I kept looking up and seeing the movement, but never the source, only the swaying of a branch after something had left it, the shower of needles, the displacement of air. It kept pace with us for the full mile back to where the hemlocks gave way to hardwood, and then it stopped. Leonora, characteristically, said nothing about it until we were back at the car. Then she said, "I've been in a lot of mountain environments. Trees don't move like that." I know, I'd come to the same conclusion. The next morning I found one of the blown eggs on my windshield, still intact, still on its thread tied to one of the windshield wipers. I'd locked the car. The parking lot was at the base of the Forest Service road, 8 miles from where we'd seen the line. I kept the egg for a while and then, for reasons I can't fully articulate, threw it away. Some things you don't want to hold onto too long. Story 13. The town of Grierson, West Virginia, has about 400 people in it and a diner on Main Street that serves the best gravy biscuits I've ever had in my life. I want to say that first, because I want to be fair to the place. The town itself is fine. It's the road that leads in from the east side, County Road 14, through the Briggs Hollow, that has the history. I wasn't from Grierson. I'd been driving through on my way to a weekend with a college friend, heading west from Charlottesville on the scenic route because I had time and because I'd bought myself an atlas that spring with the specific intention of using back roads whenever possible. County Road 14 looked like exactly what I wanted, a ridge road with views. I was 33, I had nowhere to be until Saturday, and it was a Thursday afternoon in October. The road was everything I'd hoped for the first 10 miles. Ridge line, valley views, the hardwoods in full color, that particular October palette that I'd moved to Virginia specifically to be near and still found overwhelming every year. I had my windows down and my heater running simultaneously, the way you do in that specific autumn temperature range, and I was genuinely happy in a way that felt simple and sufficient. The hollow began where the ridge road descended. The road dropped off the ridgeline into a narrow valley, creek running along the base, hillsides rising steep on both sides, the canopy closing over until it felt more like a tunnel than a road. The color went out of things. The light, which had been amber and warm on the ridge, became gray and filtered, and the temperature dropped fast enough that I rolled the windows up. I passed through without stopping, but slowly. The road required it, tight curves following the creek, the occasional washed section. There were no houses in the hollow, no fields, nothing that suggested human presence except the road itself. I was about a mile through it, maybe 2 miles from the far end, when I saw the figure standing in the road ahead. It was a person, obviously a person, standing still facing away from me at the side of the road. I assumed a hiker, a local, someone whose car had broken down, and I slowed and pulled up alongside and lowered my window. The person, a woman I thought, from the silhouette, dark hair, standing very still, didn't turn. I said hello, nothing. I said excuse me, do you need help? Nothing. I was starting to feel the first edge of discomfort, the friction between trying to be helpful and the fact that something about the stillness was wrong when the woman's head began to turn. She turned to look at me, and her face when it came around was the most profoundly wrong thing I've seen in my life. Not grotesque, I want to be specific about that. Not wounded or monstrous. Just wrong in the way that something is wrong when it looks like a face, but the weight and arrangement of the features is off by some degree that you can't measure but absolutely cannot accept. The eyes were too deep. The mouth was wrong in its geometry. The way a mouth drawn from memory rather than observation might be wrong. And she smiled at me with that wrong mouth, with a smile that used the right muscles in the wrong sequence, and said my name. My first name only. Clear, unhurried, in a voice that was accented in a way I'd never heard. I drove. I don't know what I said first. I may have said nothing. I drove and I got out of the hollow and I kept going until I reached Grierson and I pulled into the diner parking lot because it was the first sign of life I saw and I just needed to be around people. I sat in the diner for almost 2 hours, had biscuits and gravy and coffee. The woman who refilled my coffee looked at me at some point and asked if I was all right. I said yes, just a long drive. She nodded with the particular lack of curiosity of someone who doesn't ask questions about people who come through from the hollow road. That was enough. The not tasking was enough. I drove out of Grierson going west, away from County Road 14. The question I've never answered is how she knew my name. I'd never been to that county before. I'd never told anyone where I was going that day. Simone, my road trip friend at the other end of the drive, didn't know my route. Nobody knew I was on that road. I have no explanation. I've stopped looking for one. But sometimes when I'm alone and I hear someone say my name in a way that's slightly off, wrong emphasis, wrong timing, I have a reaction that's completely disproportionate to what happened, and I have to talk myself down from it. That's what she left me with. Just the sound of my own name and the uncertainty of knowing that something out there knows it. Story 14. The last story I want to share is the one I've told the fewest times, partly because it's the hardest to describe and partly because I know how it sounds. But I've been telling these other stories and it seems dishonest to leave this one out. I'm 56 now. This happened when I was 43. I was working as a contractor doing structural assessments on rural properties for an insurance firm. Going out to farms and remote properties, writing reports on building condition. It was solitary work, often in remote places, and I'd been doing it for 12 years without incident, which is maybe why I was unprepared. The property was in the Hocking Hills region of Ohio, off a gravel road in a section of second-growth forest and overgrown pasture. The farmhouse had been unoccupied for 3 years following the owner's death. A nephew had inherited it and was trying to sell, and the insurance report was part of the due diligence. I had a file with photographs, a structural checklist, and an address. I drove out on a Tuesday in March, early spring, the trees still bare and the sky the particular flat white of overcast Ohio. The farmhouse was a standard late 19th century structure, 2-story clapboard wood shingle roof. The condition was poor but not catastrophic, some siding damage, a soft spot on the porch, the outbuildings in worse shape than the house. I spent about an hour doing the exterior assessment and making notes, and then I went inside. The house smelled like cold and closed rooms, mustiness and old wood, and something faintly sweet that I couldn't identify. The interior was partially furnished, the previous owner having apparently not removed much. An old couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a wood stove in the living room with ash still in the firebox. I worked through the rooms methodically, testing floors, checking the ceiling for water staining, noting the condition of the windows. On the second floor, in what had been a bedroom, I found the mirror. It was a full-length standing mirror, old, the silver backing gone dark at the edges, framed in dark wood that had been carved not ornately, but with a kind of patient repetition, the same shape repeated around the frame, an elongated oval with a line through it. The mirror had been placed facing the corner, which is the way you store a mirror you're not using, and I made a note of it, not because it was structurally relevant, but because I was thorough. I finished the second floor and came back downstairs. I was doing my final notes on the porch when I realized I'd left my clipboard on the windowsill of the bedroom upstairs. I went back up. The mirror was no longer facing the corner. It was facing the room. Facing outward, facing the doorway, the way you place a mirror you want to use. I stood in the doorway and looked at my own reflection, and my reflection looked back at me, and then, I know how this sounds, my reflection smiled. A fraction of a second after I noticed it, with a delay between my face and my reflection's face that should not exist. I looked at my own face. I was not smiling. My expression was neutral, and the reflections had been a smile, and the time lag between the two had been short but real. I went down the stairs and out the front door and sat in my car for 15 minutes without writing anything. Then I drove out, finished my report from memory and notes, and submitted it without mentioning the mirror. I told myself I'd misread what I'd seen. The light had been poor. I was tired. Mirrors behave strangely in old houses. I've spent years on that explanation, and it still doesn't fit cleanly. But it's the only one I have that doesn't require me to accept something I'm not prepared to accept. The nephew sold the property within the month. I don't know what happened to the mirror. What I know is that for about 6 months after that assessment, I'd occasionally catch my reflection in mirrors at home, in the bathroom, at work, anywhere, and there would be a half second where the reflection and I would look at each other before it matched what I did. And in that half second, I never knew quite which one of us was going to move first. That stopped eventually, or I stopped noticing. I'm not certain those are the same thing. Thank you for watching. If these stories stayed with you or kept you up longer than you plan to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next collection. These roads, these hollows, these places that sit just outside the edge of what we're comfortable with, there are more of them than most people realize, and there are more stories. Let me know in the comments which one got under your skin the most. Share this with someone who appreciates a good scare, and if you've got a story of your own from a road you shouldn't have been on, you know where to find us. Stay safe out there, and maybe stay on the main roads tonight.